Hi and welcome to Conversations with Robyn. On today's program we have Dr. Joe Dispenza, and many of you may know Joe by the doco-drama What the Bleep Do You Know? Welcome to the program, Joe.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Robyn.
Thank you so much for including us as part of your tour in Australia.
Thank you.
If I was going to introduce you, the broader version, what would I be saying?
Well, I think most people know me from the movie What the Bleep Do We Know? I think it was a good beginning for people to begin to examine the nature of reality, examine the idea of how they fit into their life and what the idea of change is all about. Mm-hmm. I have a background in neuroscience. I have a degree in chiropractic. I have a background in biochemistry. And I pretty much lecture now teaching people about the biology of change, what neuroscience has to say about the potential for people to change their mind and what it does, not only to their bodies, but ultimately in their lives.
Okay. And you're just finishing your tour in Australia. Mm-hmm. Where did you visit?
Well, we started off in Perth. We did a seminar and workshop there. Then we went to Brisbane, then to Melbourne, and finished in Sydney.
Okay. And what's the feedback you've been getting from Australians?
I think for the most part, as I said in my talk in Sydney yesterday, in Australia there's a great balance between head and heart. I think most people want to understand philosophically information and then get about finding out the practical applications. And I think when we begin to apply what we learn, I think when we have the opportunity to demonstrate it, I think that people are more empowered. And it was pretty much well received amongst everybody, because if science says something is possible, then it gives us permission to accept a little bit more about our potential and a little bit more about our own personal greatness. So I think my message is to inspire people, and I think in Australia it was really well received, and I actually enjoyed myself quite a bit.
Well, I was at your workshop in Sydney yesterday, and I think the one thing that really impressed me, inverted commas, was how simplistic your message is. I mean, it's in one way it's a very intense subject. You seem to have the knack of making it so understandable and achievable.
Well, I think that everybody wants to understand things in its most simplistic form. I think that I spend a lot of time reading boring research articles that nobody really cares to read, and I look for one gem or one jewel out of that article that I think, for me, I want to know how to apply it. I want to know how we can take the next step to begin to make personal changes, not only within ourselves, but within our lives. And I think all great truths come down to a very simple understanding. I think that we have to reach sometimes to be able to understand it or run it through our own personal neurological processes to find solutions. But I think people meet truth on their own level, and for me, I always want to refine it to the most simplest message, because people can remember a simple message, and then depending on where the person's at in terms of their mind, some people understand the science behind it. Mm-hmm. Other people like to relate allegorically to the cultural or religious, associations. But simple truths seem to sustain the measure of time.
Okay, and that's part of what your book's about, also, isn't it?
Well, the book's about the science of changing your mind, and I think that, the original manuscript was 1,000 pages long, and I kept telling my publisher, this is 2 books, and they wanted me to do it in one. So, it's a little bit technical in certain parts, but, if you understand what science has to say about what's called neuroplasticity, our ability to upscale the hardware in our brain and to change, and not only change the hardware but the software, I think that people have hope. And I think that when we have hope, we have another day to live.
Okay. How would you then start to explain, in the simplistic language that is understandable, of what it all means about the science of changing your mind?
Well, you were at the workshop yesterday. What did you get from it?
Okay, what I got from it was, and for me, it's very much about visualizing that when we do something constantly, a habit, it forms a certain pathway in our brain. And then as we start to recognize that this is what we're doing, and the fact that our body then takes that on board and almost becomes the driver, we actually have another way that we can start retraining and doing new pathways. And as the new pathways happen, the old ones let go.
That's exactly the truth. That in fact, that most people, you know, with the habit, in a habit, the body becomes the mind. If we repeat the same thoughts and the same actions over and over again, the law in neuroscience is a concept called Hebbian learning, which says nerve cells that fire together wire together. And if we keep the same thoughts going and we keep performing the same actions, we hardwire our brain into very, very predictable patterns. That is the box of the brain. The box of the brain is the most commonly fired, most neurologically set of circuits that we continuously attend to. And so then to change then is to break the habit of being ourselves. And we have to begin by making that change by learning new information, by learning knowledge. Knowledge is what forces the brain to fire in new patterns and new sequences. Once we learn something new, we make a new connection or we make a new circuit. If we just learn something new, we're already beginning to change the mind. If we can remember it, we can maintain or sustain those connections. But that's not enough, because that's just philosophy, that's just intellectual jargon. We can store that in the thinking part of our brain, but the true maverick, the true individual, takes that knowledge and personalizes it, applies it, demonstrates it. And when we apply knowledge and we personalize it, we have a new experience. An experience is when we teach the body, sensory-wise, what the mind has learned. And so most people get in the habit of being themselves by the time they're 35 years old. The personality is pretty much a finite set of neurological circuits, and if we repeat an action enough times, we can train the body to remember as well as the mind. And we have enough of those automatic programs that ultimately create a finite individual with a set of, you know, predispositions that keep us doing the same things and thinking the same ways and expecting a different result. I think when we reach that point, we're headed for our genetic destiny. And so the book is about, and the workshop is about, going from thinking to doing to being, to become conscious of those unconscious programs and begin to look at them under a microscope so that we can then gain conscious control over something that was once unconscious. Given that, we understand that if we can inhibit or stop certain thought processes or certain actions, the universal law says you don't use it, you lose it. Nerve cells that no longer fire together, they no longer wire together. And it gives people the understanding how they can change the mind. And the mind basically is the brain in action or the brain at work. So if you learn new things, you apply it, you force the brain to work in new sequences, new patterns, and new combinations, you're making a new mind. And the idea is to be able to not just apply information or knowledge to have a new experience once. It's to be able to retrain the body over and over again to be able to do it consistently. And that's when we replace old memories with new memories. That's when we upscale the brain's hardware and have the mind and body working together. And when we have the mind and body working together, the heart is open. And certainly there's enough room for that, I think, in our world today.
Okay. I'm going to take a break. And when we come back, one of the questions I'd like to ask is, what's the difference between our mind and our brain?
Okay.
Amongst others. Stay with us. Hi, and thank you for coming back. And we're here with Dr. Joe Dispenza, and we're talking about how to change your mind. Before the break, Joe, sometimes I hear people ask that question, what is the difference between our mind and our brain? How would you answer that one?
That's a fair question to ask.
Good.
Well, you know, some people say that, you know, when we talk about changing our mind, we're not talking about the fickleness that people make based on circumstances to make choices based on one decision or another decision. When we talk about changing our mind, we're talking about literally rolling up a whole set of automatic attitudes and thoughts and actions and recreating, unlearning an old aspect of self and relearning a whole new aspect of self. Now, neuroscience used to say that the brain was hardwired, meaning you're born with a certain amount of circuits and connections, and you're pretty much going to turn out like your parents or close to your parents, and that's the end of the story. But now they're saying that that's absolutely not true, that through learning and experiencing, we can begin to modify the brain. Now, the brain is an organ where there's about 100 billion neurons seamlessly wired together. And they used to say neurons were like wires, but in fact, each neuron is like a computer with a lot of megabytes of RAM. So the way neurons assemble themselves and how they connect determines our mind. Now, because there's 100 billion neurons pieced together in the brain, where there's the greatest number of neurons, there's the greatest amount of intelligence, the greatest ability to learn, and the most control over modifying our behaviors to have new experiences. There's also neurons assembled in the brain that have to do with subconscious mechanisms. Your heart beatings right now, you're digesting your food, your kidneys are filtering blood. That's all happening in a different set of neurological actions. Well, the brain is the organ that processes thought, and without life, the brain is just an organ no different than a liver or a kidney or a gallbladder. The mind is the brain in action. The mind is the brain at work. Mind is what the brain does. So because there's 100 billion neurons, and give you an idea of how much 100 billion is, if you took a sheet of paper and you stacked 100 billion sheets of paper on top of it, it would be 5,000 miles high. So that's almost, 10,000 kilometers, just a little under that.
About 8.
Yeah, about 8 or 9.
Yeah.
So we have these individual biocomputers that can assemble themselves, and the way they assemble themselves is that the brain tends to reflect our environmental experiences. So we have our environmental experiences, and we have our genetics that we inherit from our parents, and both of those two elements, nature and nurture, environment and genetics, tends to give us the sum total of our individual self. Mind is when the brain is working a certain way. It's when the brain is turned on and it's working. So what happens with most people is they tend to attend to the same thoughts. They attend to the same feelings. They attend to the same memories. And this mobile thing called attention, if we keep it on the same thoughts and the same feelings and the same behaviors, then we produce the same level of mind consistently. And I think that's the tragedy, because if you look at one of the things that people have in common that live above 100 years old, is one of the 4 things they have in common is that they never stop learning. So when we stop learning and we start feeling, I think we're headed for our genetic destiny.
Okay. What I would like to ask you here is, the starting to feel, an example. One of the things you discussed yesterday with people who were sick, had a disease, and the commonality of those that were able to move through to wellness and those that took their diagnosis as basically a death sentence. What was the difference in how they changed? And
I think, I mentioned 4 things in the seminar yesterday in my research with spontaneous remissions. My research over the last 8 years has been studying people with serious health conditions: cancer, diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol levels, thyroid imbalances, lung conditions, rare genetic disorders that medical science had no solution for. And these people basically changed their mind. And, we have this element in us called the human spirit, and that translates into, in terms of personality, it translates into will. And I think that when people make up their mind about their life, when we make a firm decision about something, I think that's the moment that the mind and body begin to work together. We're so wishy-washy in our decisions. We say one thing, but we tend to do something else. When people are faced with fatality, they forego their typical routine social engagements, and they forego their need to be entertained, and they forego their comfort zones in their world, and they have to actually get clear that they want to live. And the people that I studied with remissions, the beauty behind these people was that they were all simple people. and they had a desire to live, and they had that passion for a new life. They wanted to reinvent themselves. They wanted to become somebody else. They no longer wanted to think and feel in the same way, and they made it the most important thing to themselves. And we could actually change our brain just by thinking about it. Neuroscience has proven that enough. So they believed that their thoughts created their condition, that their reaction to the environment, the chemicals of stress, we all know, are what pushes the trigger or pulls the trigger that creates disease in the body. And most adult onset diseases are created from the chemicals of stress, cortisones and adrenalines. They understood that. They understood that they were unhappy for 20 years, and that it was their own thinking and reacting that began to cause their health condition to manifest. And they came right up against the wall and they said, listen, I got to begin to think and act differently. And they began to plan in their mind how they were no longer going to think and act.
Because they recognized how they had been and the direction it took them in.
And of course, based on what we said, the fact that they were inhibiting the typical thought processes and the typical actions, they were no longer firing the same circuits. And they didn't revisit that same attitude. So the old self began to fall apart neurologically. At the same time, they began to mentally rehearse a new way of being. They began to plan and remember the greatest aspect of themselves that they wanted to begin to demonstrate in their lives. And as they began to think about it, they began to make their brain work in new ways, and they actually created a new mind. In the process of doing it, they had long moments where they were so involved with what they were thinking about that they lost track of time and space. They had no idea how much time went by. And of course, when we were able to do that, we moved from the state of survival to the state of creation. And survival is where all your attention is on the body, the environment, and time. When we live in survival, we're addicted to the environment, we're addicted to our body, and we're certainly addicted to time. But in true creation, when we're involved in creation, when we're enjoying the moment of being the idea in and of itself, there comes a moment where we forget about ourselves. And of course, when you forget about the old self, that's the moment that a greater mind can move in. That's the moment when this spiritual aspect of ourselves, this God within, this innate intelligence, this life force, this universal mind, whatever you want to call it, can finally say, he's out of the way. She's out of the way. I can begin now to through a greater mind, organize health in the body again. And those people actually, they all had the same thing in common. They all understood that what was keeping their heart beating and that was digesting their food and making 10 million cells every second was the life force that they were connected to. And they wanted to give it some orders or some directions, and they wanted to become somebody else. And then they wanted to surrender and get out of the way and let this greater mind do the healing for them. And I think this greater mind gives life to whoever we're being. Certainly, if your thinking brain and your body has a certain set of circuits in place based on your genetics and your experiences and things that you learn, that greater mind gives life to you just like it gives life to me, that gives life to the holy man, that gives life to the white person, the black person, the Hispanic person, that gives life to all beings, independent of culture and race and gender and thank God, gender and creed and age and social status and political beliefs. It's an objective mind, and they developed a relationship with it. They took the time, every day to give thanks that they were alive. And I think when we acknowledge this greater mind, I think that it begins to work for us in very unpredictable ways.
We're basically talking about we're all born equal in our ability to do that.
We're all born,
if we choose.
We're all born with the same material. Yeah.
Okay, we'll take a break, and when we come back, I'd like to talk more about, you use the rehearsal word, what it is you do in the morning. With that, stay with us. Thank you for coming back. And Joe, before the break, we were talking about people who wanted to go onto the path of wellness, and you mentioned the rehearsal word, and I wonder if you could share with us how it is you start your day by doing this mind change.
Well, I've had a lot of great opportunities in my life to apply everything that I intellectually have learned, and some of the opportunities were not consciously created by me, but I've been involved in many, many different schools of thought, and one of the things I came across in my research into explaining spontaneous remissions, and then getting a degree in neuroscience, is that there is this concept called mental rehearsal, which says, if you take a group of people that never played the piano and you teach them scales and chords, and they physically demonstrate those actions, and they practice it for enough days, they'll grow new brain circuits. Simple concept: you learn something new, you make new connections, you repeat it, you pay attention, you get a little instruction, that the act of physically demonstrating it over and over again, new brain circuits will form. You can take another group of people and you can have them mentally rehearse playing those scales and chords, never touch the piano, and they can become so involved with what they're doing that there comes a moment where the brain doesn't know the difference between what's happening out there and what's happening in here. And the privilege of being a human being is that we can make thought more real than anything else. That's the gift. And mental rehearsal means then, if you can begin to think about things and remember things, learn new things and repeat them, and keep your attention on it, that the brain will capture the thought as the experience in and of itself, which means you can rewire your brain through the process of paying attention and through the process of mental rehearsal. So the question, of course, is, what do we mentally rehearse all day long, and what do we physically demonstrate? I.e., what do we think about and how do we act? Because that determines who we are as the neurological self, as the personality, as the identity. So if you knew that, then, and you wanted to begin to look at how you could change, and I never use the word visualization anymore because it excludes people. Too many people get hung up on the semantics of the word visualization. But mental rehearsal means that, can you concept yourself in the action? And for certain people, they see that very visually. And it's funny because most men say, well, I close my eyes and I don't see anything. It's dark in there. And then I say, can you see yourself hitting a golf ball? And they say, oh, yeah. I said, that's it. So I use the word rehearsal so that everybody's included.
Yep.
And for me, there's an element when I rehearse that's very kinesthetic. It's very physical. There's an element that's kind of what I'm saying to myself, and there's an element that's very visual. So it's a combination, sensory-wise, of how we format mind. So if you knew that to be the truth, and you believed it to be, in fact, the way it is, then we could make many different levels of mind just by rehearsing, by planning, by memorizing, by thinking in new ways. So if you woke up in the morning and you asked yourself, what is the greatest ideal of myself today? I mean, that's what I ask myself. And if you wait for an answer without filling it in with all the things you have to do and all the places you have to go and all the time or little time you have to do certain things, I think if you wait for the answer and you're the scientist in your life, if you're really interested in doing a better job in your life, I think you'll immediately come up with some really cool ways to think. And so I think, how would I think if I was the greatest ideal of myself? How would I act? How would I be? How would I feel? What would I not think? What would I not do? What would I not be? In the process of coming up with a solution, and then I don't get up until I actually feel like I'm that person. And I know that when we begin to feel like it, now we have mind and body on the same page. Now we're training the body, we're conditioning the body to learn what the mind has embraced. And that's the moment that we start to see unpredictable and uncommon things happen in our life. And I think that's when it gets pretty exciting.
Okay. And you have 2 children, don't you?
3 children.
3, oh sorry,
Yeah.
3 children.
Yeah.
And you've actually, as they've grown, introduced them to this rehearsal.
My kids are all at different stages of development, but they all have to work on something. They're always working on a dream or an idea. They're always working on something, and my kids, and I think all kids, are fabulous creators. You know, you don't think they're paying attention, you don't think they're interested, but when it comes time to doing it, they accept so easily that they put adults to shame pretty quickly. So, I mean, all three of my kids have created fabulous things, and it's not so much for me with them that I want them to create material things. I just want them to know that they can't get what they want in their lives unless they have intention. That is the compass. That is the director. You know, and you may not even believe in the quantum law of spirit or any of that stuff, but if you believe that your intention allows you to make choices, then if you're clear on your intention and you're clear on your purpose, you'll always make the choice for yourself that is not the common choice, because the common choice would lead you back to the old self. So with my kids, you know, they joke with me all the time because they always go, "Oh God, here we go. It's the lecture series. We got to listen." But they love it because I'm appealing to their secret belief that they can do a better job in life, and because of that, they scramble a little bit, and they don't feel like it, and they got too many things, and they got a lot of social engagements. But I get in their face enough. Because I want them to have the experience, and of course, when they do have the experience, then it's all gold, and they love their life, and they love what they're doing.
Okay, because it's about them using their imagination. Well, all of us, isn't it? If we use our imagination.
I think it's actually, imagination is one ingredient.
Okay, what are the others?
Well, you can't just have imagination without will.
True.
Because some people who imagine without intention, without getting clear on what they want, they make these sharp turns, and they're swimming with dolphins, and they're out in outer space. And not that I mind that, but I just don't think it has any realistic application. I think that you have to have a certain degree of practicality and intention along with imagination, and you have to have this passion, this will, and then you have to have this kind of immaterial knowing how to surrender, how to give it up, how to live as if it's already been taken care of, to be in the joy of the gift of life, and that it's a mystery and that it's an adventure. And I can tell you from watching my children and the experiences that I've had, that when I'm in that state of mind, things happen in terms of unusual events that I think would have never happened if I was being the contracted, predicting, calculating, analyzing, self that we find ourselves in when we're missing magic in our lives.
It's a key word, isn't it? The magic. Another break. Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us, and we're having a fascinating conversation with Dr. Joe Dispenza. Joe, we've been doing a lot of talking about the brain, the mind, the journey, a little bit about your journey. When you were a kid, was there anything that you really wanted a burning desire to do?
As a kid, I was just one of those young people that always had 1,000 questions, and I always investigated the answers for myself. I was one of those kids that loved to look up answers, and I had this weird, quirky thing where I love to dovetail information together. I'd love to take unrelated topics and somehow, dovetail them together to a greater understanding. And as a kid, I was always interested in the brain, believe it or not, and interested in the mind, and interested in human potential, and kind of got me going off in this very Eastern point of view at a very early age, studying yoga and martial arts, and studying all kinds of Eastern beliefs, and it was healthy for me because I think that I went from this very mechanistic model of the way reality appeared, it opened my eyes to this more of a vitalistic understanding that particles are alive and things have an awareness, and I was fascinated by that as a kid, and it opened a lot of doors for me.
Okay. What age would you have been this fascination started kicking in?
Oh, probably 12 or 13, and of course, you know, I read some really fun books at an early age, and really it opened my eyes from 12 or 13, and I think our identity begins to form around that early teen age, and all the things, you know, I came across this book when I was 16 years old, and all the things I was interested in were all considered, you know, avant-garde or unusual or unproven. And I love that idea because it had me delve into it a little bit further. So, by the way, all those things today are considered, you know, mainstream beliefs. And so, you know, I kind of dabbled in a lot of things, and I think all of those things helped me to piece together different elements of what I'm interested in.
Okay. When did you decide to do chiropractic, and why?
Oh, well, it was kind of funny. I was, as a 15-year-old kid, I was very academically oriented, and I wanted to know what I wanted to do at 15 or 16, and of course I was going to go to school to study medicine, and I had all the grades in place and had all the opportunity to do it, and started reading about chiropractic and started reading about this vitalistic model of the life force and the central nervous system and the brain and the spinal cord. And of course I was just starting to study yoga at that time, and it all made sense to me. And you know, the principle in chiropractic is the power that made the body heals the body, and I believe in that very strongly. I don't think there's any healing that takes place that isn't a spiritual healing, that doesn't involve a vitalistic energy. And so I asked my dad to take me to a seminar with other doctors of chiropractic. I was 16 years old, and he took me to this chiropractic seminar, and I participated with all the doctors and learned all the material, and then went to another seminar, and I was on my way. I mean, I went to undergraduate school and, you know, studied pre-med, and then went to chiropractic college, and I just was clear the moment I understood the concepts, the philosophy. I was on board.
Okay, and then you had a bike accident.
Yeah, I got run over by a truck. Yeah. I just was in a triathlon and wasn't actually going to do the race. Last minute decided to do it, and got run over by a truck on my bicycle. The truck was going 55 miles an hour, and the woman that hit me in this Bronco, in this SUV, either her reflexes were bad or she didn't know that she hit me, but she dragged me down the road quite a ways, and anyway, I wound up breaking 6 bones in my back, and the diagnosis was pretty poor. And it was a turning point in my life because I had to take everything that I studied, you know, everything that I learned, everything that I believed in, and forego the conventional route, which I don't recommend a lot of people do, but this was me, and I had a pretty good understanding of spinal biomechanics and pretty good understanding of what was possible, good understanding of the subconscious mind at the time, and I decided to take a chance. I decided after 4 opinions from 4 of the leading surgeons in Southern California to pass on the surgery, and I began to use my mind and use this energy, this innate intelligence within every person. Thought if I could contact it, I could actually get it to work for me. And I spent 4 hours a day connected and just working.
And how long did it take to get back to wellness?
Well, they told me it would take 6 months to a year, and I'd have to wear a body cast, and if I could ever walk again, they didn't think I would. And I was back in my office seeing patients in 10 weeks, no body cast or nothing. And the thing was about it all, I mean, you know, that moment in my life, that experience in my life was pretty self-determining because, you know, when you're laying in bed, you know, and confronting all these thoughts, real or imagined, you don't ever know at that time. I think the worst of human suffering is indecision, and once I made that decision that I wasn't going to have the surgery, I started getting very clear. When I started getting some feedback and started feeling better and started feeling sensations and started having physiological changes, I knew that I was onto something, and then there was nobody that was going to tell me and that there was any other way, and I just made a deal with myself that if I was ever able to walk again, I'd spend the rest of my life studying the mind-body connection, and that's kind of what my life's been about.
It's interesting, isn't it, that people that are out there doing this work are often confronted with a huge life-changing situation that asks them to, okay, now really walk the talk.
Well, you have to.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to go from 100 miles an hour to 0. And I was a 25-year-old kid living in Southern California. I mean, I had a great life, and you know, had a great practice and had a great nucleus of friends, and I was free, and this was a real inconvenience for me. You know, it was a real inconvenience, and by the same means, in hindsight, I had to. That's what it took for me to stop, I think, and ask some really big questions. Who am I? You know, where am I going? What is life? Well, you know, how did I get here? And I don't think I would have ever asked those questions at the pace I was going. I mean, I don't think I would have even had the sensitivity or the sensibility to ask the questions at the time.
Okay. Got a lot more questions, and I'll leave one more segment. Come back with us for the last part of our conversation with Joe. See you soon. Thank you for staying with us. We're doing our last part of the program with Dr. Joe Dispenza. And Joe, I asked you during the break, could you just talk a little bit on Alzheimer's and dementia and how this fits in? Because we've got a pretty aging population. And
well, the latest research on Alzheimer's says if you want to prevent it, learn something new every day. I mean, you can't have Alzheimer's unless you begin to lose your declarative memories. You can't have Alzheimer's unless you start forgetting about things you learn and things you experience. And with Alzheimer's, that's the first memory system to go. It's called our declarative memory system. There's also research that shows that certain toxicities like mercury and heavy metals have an influence on gene activation to make the amyloid protein. There's also research that shows that head injuries, that if people have one strong head injury, they're 8 to 9 times more likely to have Alzheimer's from a head injury. And head injuries are the reason for many, many different types of brain conditions. And then there's just the people who carry the gene, and then they live a very stressful life, and they fall into routine. And I think it's the routine and the chemicals of stress that begin to turn on those genes that create disease. But just because you have the gene expression doesn't necessarily mean you have to have the condition. There's ways to prevent it, and there's certainly ways to slow the process down. The problem is that once it starts happening, then it's harder to begin to control. So if the person knows that they have a family history of it, then they have to get about staying out of routine, learning new things, having new experiences, you know, crossword puzzles or reading books or playing chess or any of those things that keep the mind turned on. And certainly a great way to begin. And there's certainly a lot of nutritional supplementation now that's being correlated with the prevention of Alzheimer's. Okay.
Heart-mind connections.
Well, you know, heart and mind, will and mind, there has to be a balance between head and heart. You see, the head is the thinking and the heart is the feeling. And there is this loop between thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking. And that's what creates what is called a state of being. So if people think sad thoughts or unhealthy thoughts, or if they think suffering thoughts, they begin to feel suffering. They begin to feel unhappy. And when that happens, those negative thoughts, I hate to use the word negative, but those self-depreciating or self-limiting thoughts tend to turn on the body's survival centers that have to do with feeling certain emotions. That's not a heartfelt experience, that's the survival experience. When we are truly in the state of heartfelt emotions, those emotions have to do with giving and altruism and love and expansion and inspiration. Those feelings are not associated with survival at all. We have survival and we have creation. And in the state of creation or creativity or expansion or flourishing or growth, the balance between head and heart then means that you're actually thinking a certain way and you're actually demonstrating what you're thinking. And when you have your body doing what your mind wants, that's when the heart is open. When head and heart are aligned, when mind and body are working together, that's when the heart tends to be open. So if people just took a few minutes and got in touch every day with a heartfelt emotion of joy, they would begin to think equal to how they feel. Mm-hmm. And I'm certain that a lot of conditions that have to do with the heart are from people who are from the attitude of shutting off the expression or the feeling of those emotions.
Okay, because you were also talking yesterday about doing the rehearsal first thing in the morning when we wake up and last thing at night before we go to sleep, because our brains are in a more receptive...
Well, the subconscious mind, the door to the subconscious mind is open when we wake up in the morning and we go to sleep at night. And if we're interested in programming the subconscious mind, the analytical mind is at its height in the middle of the day.
Yep.
You can't slow it down. It already is tapped in or connected to the environment. When you wake up in the morning and when you go to bed at night, your analytical mind is relatively well, it's not solidified. So when you wake up in the morning and you can't remember who you are and you're waking up, it's a good time to begin to rehearse because you can remember yourself as somebody else. When you go to bed at night, the analytical mind's too tired to actually analyze any longer, so the door between the conscious mind and the subconscious mind is open.
Okay. The difference between belief and will?
Well, our thoughts actually are they come from our memories. That when we learn something and we have experiences, but primarily our thoughts come from things that we're exposed to, and it usually it's related to learning. If we take a series of thoughts and we cluster them together, thought, we create what's called an attitude. An attitude is just a cluster of thoughts that have been lined up. If you take attitudes and you piece those attitudes together, now we're talking about beliefs. And if you then take beliefs and you chunk them together, now we're talking about perceptions. And perception then allows us to choose the relationships we have, the things we learn. Our perceptions are involved in everything that we do. And it is perception that gives us the permission to see the world as a beautiful place, or see the world as a harsh environment. And we make those states of perception based on how we chemically are experiencing internally the world and how we're wired. And so the neurochemical self is an accumulation of experiences and learning that creates attitudes, that creates beliefs, that creates perceptions.
Okay. Yesterday in the workshop you were talking about, we can have a mood. And if we stay in that mood long enough, that leads to, what was that next step?
A temperament. A
temperament, which if we stay there long enough leads to...
Personality trait. Yeah, so, the way it is that you have an emotional reaction. An emotional reaction has the release of chemicals. Those chemicals then have what's called the refractory period after those release of chemicals. Now, in the West, we think emotions are so real, but really they're just chemically based. And so a person has an emotional reaction. They feel angry, they feel frustrated, they feel sad. The ability to be able to shorten that refractory period is the ability to have a certain degree of emotional control. People who tend to keep that refractory period going for days or weeks, that turns into a mood. And the mood is just an extended emotional reaction that we keep those chemicals going, which then turns into temperaments and ultimately personality traits.
And one of the things you were saying is we can just say the word stop.
Yeah, that's one of the mechanisms where we develop conscious control, and I do that all the time. I guess the question that I ask myself when I'm in an emotional reaction is I always ask myself the same question: is this loving to me? That's what I really ask. Is this chemistry? Knowing what those emotional reactions do to the brain and body, is this loving to me? And if I can really stop and ask that question and wait for a sincere answer, the answer is always no. No one or nothing is worth that emotional reaction. I mean, the initial emotional reaction is a very real thing. But the way in which we cope with that emotional reaction can be monitored by our own conscious will.
Okay. So much isn't there? The next book that you're writing is to do with what? Feeling, thinking, being.
Well, the next book's called Thinking, Doing, and Being, Manual for
whatever.
Change. Yeah. And there are 3 brain systems in place. I mean, in the book Evolve Your Brain, the first book that I wrote, the last chapter, chapter 12, is about the concept of thinking, doing, and being. And it was a hint to let people know that there are 3 brain systems in place, that we can actually create a state of being. And when we create a state of being, it means that we have trained the body to be the mind. Now, most of the time, people are being unhappy, or they're being unworthy, or they're being confused because they went from thinking to doing to being. They thought certain ways. They acted in congruence with those thoughts, and by repeating the same actions over and over again, they got all 3 brain systems going in place, and now that person's unhappy or they're suffering. And when that internal order has been consistent, there really isn't anything from their external environment that can move them from that state of unhappiness. You can try to rouse them, you can try to excite them, you can try to teach them, but really no new information is going to enter into the system. Well, because there's 3 brain systems in place, the neocortex, the feeling brain, or the limbic brain, and the cerebellum, we could also train the mind and body to begin to think in new ways, apply what we learn, have a new experience, and if we're able to repeat that experience, we create a new state of being. So we could either choose to be in a state of suffering, or we can retrain the brain and the mind to unlearn that state of suffering and then to relearn a state of joy. And if we're good at it and we're consistent at it, then nothing in the environment should disrupt that internal order, just like the person who insists on their own suffering. So the book came out of the workshops that I do in terms of these 10 individual steps that I think are some of the important steps for personal change. And the book is really more of a manual. It's more of a journal where you get a little 2 pages or 3 pages of what neuroscience has to say, or what we can say about helping you with a little bit of information about then beginning the first step or the second step. So there's a little introduction scientifically, and then there's an exercise for you to do. And then you practice that exercise for a week, you come back, and then you add the second one, then you add the third one. And I call it the Manual for Change because pretty much in the workshops that I've done, I've seen some pretty good changes go on with people.
Okay. Let's just say there's someone watching this program, hopefully, some people watching this program, and they've created a heck of a challenging life for themselves. And they're going, yeah, that's easy enough said than done, but you haven't had this happen and you haven't had that happen, and that wouldn't work for me. If you looked into that camera over there, just as we're finishing, our conversation with you, if you looked into that camera and directed some words to them, what would you say to them?
I think people talk themselves out of greatness every single day. I think that we all do that, and those voices that we hear. One of the great moments in my life is when I realized just because I have a thought doesn't necessarily mean it's true. People talk themselves out of greatness every single day, and it's because to change means to think and act greater than the environment, to think and act greater than the circumstances in your life, to think and act greater than how you feel, to pull the mind out of the body and put it back in the brain, and that is an act of will. what happens when most people when they're uncomfortable in their life that they want to change, they look for evidence in their world, and when they can't find the evidence in their world for change, they rush back to the familiar, and they excuse themselves for not changing because of something that's happened to them in their past. And because we can excuse ourselves for something that has happened to us in our past, we're giving up the divine right that we can change. So if I said, listen, I can't change because I was abused by my parents, or I had this thing happen to me, and then I lived as if, listen, you don't understand, the reason I'm this way is because of this event. What I'm really saying is this emotion I've become so attached to that I'm using this emotion as a reason to not change. Because if they went out and had new experiences and created a new life, then that experience no longer would hold any weight, because now the new memories replace the old memories. And it's not an easy process. Change is an uncomfortable process. No one likes to hear that. But when you're getting ready to change, you're breaking all of your emotional agreements with everything and everyone in your life. And you're no longer thinking and acting in predictable ways. And of course, that's taking a moving locomotive and putting on the brakes, and there is a loud screech that goes on with it. And then you have to begin to start that locomotive up again, and overcoming that inertia is where we then begin to silently believe in ourselves. You will never find evidence in your world in change when you begin. You will always have to think greater than your environment, and you'll have to do that enough times until the environment reflects back to you exactly how you're thinking.
Once again, it could be a show, a conversation of hours with you. Hopefully you'll come back on again.
Let's hope.
And also, Joe, I would just love to do a little plug for Julianne's store.
Sure, I'd love to do one too.
Okay, you do the plug.
Well, I've had the great opportunity to be a part of Nibbana, and the girls, Julie and Annie, are a great living demonstration of their message. And when you have an opportunity to work with people like that, they're committed to flow. And flow is when the mind and body and the heart are all working together. Now, their message is really to bring new ideas to Australia, to take spiritual concepts and science and plug it into the mainstream, so that not so much that people have the edge in the world, but they live a happier life. And so I've been with them for 2 weeks, and their message is clear, their actions are aligned with their message, and I think that anybody who wants to investigate further, Nibbana is a great place for them to begin, to start.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being on the program.
Yeah.